Well, today I'm absolutely delighted to be able to speak to Sharon Stein. I've wanted to talk to you for ages, Sharon, so it's so great to be in the same virtual room together, and I'm really interested to hear your thoughts. But perhaps you'd just like to say a few words about yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm Dr. Sharon Stein. I am an assistant professor of educational studies at the University of British Columbia, which is located in what is currently known as Vancouver, Canada. I'm speaking to you today from Stolo territory. They're an indigenous nation who have had ties to this place for thousands of years. And I would like to just indicate my support for them to have their lands returned to them. This conversation about settler colonialism in the US and Canada is very pertinent to just general conversations that are happening here, as well as my own work. And as a white settler on these lands, I recognize my responsibility to ensure that we're always attending to our accountabilities to Indigenous peoples and their lands.
Well, thank you for that. And I'm sure a lot of people will recognize that from different parts of the world as well. So that's great. So I've been following your writing for some time. You've written some very interesting things. And in particular, you've focused a lot on decolonisation of the curriculum and its links to internationalisation. And I'm going to just recommend it right at the outset, this fantastic piece of yours, which I love. The persistent challenges of addressing epistemic dominance in higher education, considering the case of curriculum internationalisation. So I would recommend that to anybody who wants to read it. But you've also been instrumental in setting up the Critical Internationalisation Studies Network, and the fantastic new, as the time of recording, the masterclass in Critical Internationalisation Studies, which again, I'd highly recommend. I'm really enjoying it myself. And the other thing I've read, which is really interesting, is your workbook for people who are not themselves Indigenous peoples, and how to engage with that process. And they're all available on your ResearchGate profile. But so let's begin with decolonisation, because you're speaking to this, and it's become a massive feature of university life in recent times, particularly since the Black Lives Matter protests and all of those issues. So where do you see then decolonisation and internationalisation, the interface, yourself?
Yeah, it's such a great question, and one I've been grappling with for years, because I kind of think about my work as a scholar, as someone who works in internationalization, who works in decolonization, and the interface is something, especially in settler colonial contexts like my own, that we are still figuring out how to do. They tend to be sort of siloed conversation, this conversation about indigenization and decolonization, and the conversation about internationalization, at least in the US and Canada, because questions of decolonization here really center, or are being pushed to center, the question of Indigenous peoples and their land dispossession by settler colonial states. And then you have on the other side this question of internationalization, which here in this context is often conceptualized as international mobility, especially the arrival of international students to this context, often with an economic rationale. And actually this interface is quite not always easy to navigate between what it means to be an international student in a settler colonial context and to have this simultaneous push for indigenization and the return of Indigenous land. So I don't think it's not really an easy conversation. And I would say we're still really developing the frames and vocabularies with which to have it in a really rigorous way. At the same time, I know that some people, when they talk about decolonizing internationalization, they're not necessarily attending to this piece about Indigenous peoples and settler colonialism, especially in contexts that are not settler colonial contexts. And so I think what this also points to is the fact that it's very difficult to have one single, univocal conversation about internationalization or decolonization, because it's so determined by our context, at the same time as colonial relations affect the whole world, and they look different in different places, and there's different particular histories that we are accountable to. And yet I would say, in my analysis, the modern world as we know it is enabled through historical, systemic, and ongoing colonial violence. So it affects higher education in so many different realms. And what this means for internationalization, I think, is honestly, we're just at the very beginnings of this conversation, and it's a really important one.
Yeah, I agree, but I think so. I think, you know, we've got decolonisation, which speaks to pretty much everybody in every institution, and then the internationalisation side, which is it's a relatively young field. You know, it's only really the 1990s where this kind of began developing. And so, you know, some of us have written about how, you know, it's restricted focus on the sort of Anglo-Western approach to internationalization. We're at the point really where we need to think differently. And so this idea of critical internationalization studies network, and it has come at exactly the right time in a sense. So people involved in internationalization, many people are trying to think about how to focus more on different knowledges and different epistemologies and different understandings that maybe the international students bring to us, and that we should be listening more to that. So, I mean, I think, you know, it's perfect timing for all this in some respects, and hopefully, you know, it's going to make a big difference. I think you know, language is a big issue as well, because we're still writing in English. We require everybody to write in English, but I think we've got to think about also the link between the questions around Indigenous peoples, around equality, diversity and inclusion as a broader agenda, around migration and people presenting in our universities with very different knowledges and backgrounds, and that we're not, maybe we're struggling to integrate them rather than thinking about how we can benefit from their backgrounds and knowledges and understandings. I mean, how is that for you in Western Canada there?
Yeah, it's a big conversation about, I mean, even this notion of inclusion has become like not a contentious term. I mean, well, there's pushback amongst people who definitely don't want inclusion for sort of conservative reasons, but there's also a sort of critical pushback of saying, you know, inclusion into what, on whose terms, in whose name, for whose benefit. So I think there's a tension for those of us doing this work, because we want to pluralize the conversations we're happening and the perspectives that we're considering, but we want to do it in a way that isn't extractive or recolonizing. And that also recognizes that in some cases, international students come seeking Western knowledge, which is why they have arrived. So you know, we can't assume that there's any sort of prototypical international student and what they would be interested in as well. So there's all these different layers that we're trying to navigate as academics who are critical of sort of the economic rationale for this, as well as the colonizing Western imperialism that happens epistemically and otherwise. But we don't have, I think, we're still also developing the language to actually talk about all the complexities of desires, because this idea of the West as the height of humanity and human progress and development has been spread by the West to much of the world. It's not that every non-Western person has a critique of that. Some seek it, some negotiate in between. And I think we need to recognize that there's no homogenous international student in terms of their approach to this, and that we as faculty probably are just very unprepared to be able to do this work in a good way, because we ourselves have been trained for the most part within Western frameworks. And although we must challenge that and unlearn certain things, we also can't assume we would be able to become experts in other knowledges either. So how do we bring these things all together in a relationally rigorous way and an intellectually rigorous way? And I think that's something, again, we're really just starting to grapple with. And I don't think that's a bad thing to start with that place of, well, admitting we don't know how to do it, because then that's when you can really rethink what you've been doing.
Well, because that's going to bring me to a very difficult question then, because we started there by admitting we don't know everything or we don't know how to do it. So my question is going to be, how do we do it? Because, you know, it's partly allowing or rethinking the way that we conceptualize some of these issues, trying to then incorporate the voices of people from many different backgrounds, some of whom will perhaps feel cautious about contributing because they themselves have been led to expect things to be in a certain, Anglo-Western model, as it were. How do we actually engage, for example, researchers and writers and become more open to alternative knowledges? How do we do that?
That's a great question, because one of the things that I find, and as you mentioned, I work with the Critical Internationalization Studies Network, but I also have another research collective I'm a part of, gesturing towards decolonial futures. And this question is something we really grapple with. And part of the challenge of it is that it's not just an intellectual question. It's also an affective question of how we respond when we're challenged and when we don't understand something and when we feel uncertainty, as well as a relational question of how do we center the relationship as opposed to instrumentalizing it for, so that our curriculum is more inclusive, without actually understanding what we're bringing in. And so I think that is, again, the starting point of saying we don't actually know how to do this would be an important starting point. And I also think then this point about historicizing how we got to this point is really important, because if we don't understand how we got here to this place of Eurocentrism within our institutions, as well as not just Eurocentrism sort of epistemically, but also the material hoarding of resources in this place, then we're not going to be able to figure out how to do it differently, because we wouldn't understand what had gone wrong. So I think really tracing these different colonial histories of how we've arrived in this space is really important, and can be very uncomfortable to see our complicity, not just sort of in the past, but in ongoing ways. And yet I think if we don't start in that place of honesty and the fact that inclusion is not going to adequately redress these colonial legacies, there is a need for reparations. And the question of what reparations looks like in higher education in relation to internationalization, as well as indigenization and decolonization, are very much still open questions. We are just starting to ask that question. And we, as far as we've got, is sort of like inclusion and a little bit of redistribution, but that doesn't equal reparations. No. And I think that's where we need to go at some point.
That's a very big political point as well, of course. But just thinking about, you mentioned the word affective. And if I, for example, as an editor of a book, I'm trying to get contributions from different sources, and yet perhaps people feel, oh, well, it's being edited by somebody from an Anglo-European perspective, they won't want to hear my voice. How can I better encourage people that their voices are very important? And how can we reach people who perhaps don't feel that they've got a contribution to make? This is a big question, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, again, the starting point would be to that like self-reflexive understanding of how we got to this place, where all of our contributors are from Western countries or a white background, and sort of like, then you could start to understand why other people might want to be a part of it, because they don't actually feel welcome, or they fear that they will be treated tokenistically, which indeed often happens in this work. So part of it is like, why aren't they interested? And I think that's like that part of that honest, difficult conversation. Then the question of how to invite people in. I mean, I would say one strategy would be this very honest public self-reflection about the way that, scholarship has gone in our field, and perhaps one's own patterns in relation to this, and sort of say, we realize that we have been erasing these voices and minimizing them, and we are starting this process of figuring out how and why and how to do it differently. And we're doing it with honesty, humility, hyper self-reflexivity. And I think that as like an opening gesture is something. I actually know an example of a colleague, it wasn't their book, but they contributed to a book where at the end, the editors realized, oh, there's no Indigenous voices. Can we invite an Indigenous author? And I was like, well, I don't think that is going to cut it. But you might have in the book, in addition to trying to perhaps invite Indigenous contributors, you would have this very honest, reflexive piece about being true to the fact that when we started this book, we did not consider Indigenous perspectives. And here's why, and here's the problem there. And maybe you then eventually had Indigenous contributors or not, or maybe you invited and paid an Indigenous contributor to review the book from an Indigenous perspective and say, here's what you're missing. Like, so there's different sort of creative ways of doing this. But I think the mode of just saying like, oh, we're missing a contribution from this group, it's a representational mode that can be very tokenistic. At the same time as it is important. We can't just abandon that because it's limited, but we need to go much, much deeper.
Yeah. So how do you see then the Critical Internationalisation Studies Network taking that kind of work forward? Are you getting more and more people joining the group and joining the network and listening to, following the masterclass or reading your work, or how do you see it going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Critical Internationalization Studies Network was always conceptualized as a really broad umbrella for conversations about this work, and a place where people who in our own institutions might be the only critical voice, although that's increasingly not the case, but in many cases is, needed a place to sort of debrief and go deeper into these questions. But even amongst that group, there's a huge range of philosophical, theoretical, epistemological orientations and affiliations. And I think we've tried to make it an invitation for anyone who's interested. And I think, the people currently sort of leading and who are going to step into leadership would like to continue pushing those marginalized perspectives to the fore for people to consider, without then saying, okay, this is the new internationalization, but rather, how does this make us rethink what we have assumed internationalization is? And again, what are our accountabilities in relation to those marginalized knowledges as we continue doing this work of internationalization and continually reimagining it?
And of course, you're also gathering a lot of literature which might be less familiar to some readers as well. And if things don't appear on searches immediately, and so I think that's really, really helpful to the community. And I can only just recommend it very highly to people who are watching today. So I'll put some links below the video to make sure people can follow. But yeah, so it's just another thing I was wondering, Sharon, is how we avoid a sort of a North American perspective as opposed to a sort of series of global perspectives. When we conceptualize Anglo-Western, quite often there's a tendency to lump everything together, but actually an American university is very different from a European university and so on. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think a few things. I think one is being much more careful in our own articulations and work in this area to situate ourselves and where we're coming from, so that we recognize not only in the statement of recognition, but in the actual work we produce, that we are not a universal view from nowhere, whether we're in America or somewhere else. I think the second thing is that we don't want to lose sight at the same time of the fact that there's something across Western universities in the US, Canada, Europe, and a couple other places that is really important to consider, which is not only sort of the centering of Western perspectives, but also the colonial legacies that allowed our universities to develop and in many ways continue to thrive on this extraction. And the third piece would be, how do we, with all of these differences, perhaps develop imperfect, partial, provisional, shared languages in order to come together across these differences, and not try and seek a consensus about any definitions or about values even, but rather be able to talk about our shared condition on a finite planet. And it's a shared condition, and it's also not a shared condition because we're very unevenly positioned, but we're all facing this threat of ecological catastrophe and potential human extinction in many ways, and because of what the West has done. And so we do need to come together around that, and we need to, in that coming together, still position ourselves in relation to our different responsibilities and our different epistemological stances and everything else. So I think there's sort of many layered approach to how we challenge what you're talking about, the risk of, which is centering one position in this case, the US or the Canadian one at the expense of others.
Yeah, and those definitions are not helpful, are they? And you know, I put my hand up for this as well. So everybody's got different interpretations of internationalization, all of these different matters. And we should just perhaps put in an early plug for your book that's coming out later this year called Unsettling the University, I believe. So yeah, that should be so much interesting reading. So keep up the great work, Sharon, and it's been really interesting talking today. Thank you very much for spending time with me.
Thanks for having me.